This presentation is brought to you by the Montana Renewable Energy Association, whose mission is to foster the growth of renewable energy for all Montanans through education, advocacy, and industry engagement. Today, we're going to be talking about nuclear energy, which is a really hot topic right now in the terms of kind of what's going on with our discussions around the country. And really kind of our energy future here in Montana and really around the world. These conversations are happening at the local level, at the state level, national, international, and I'm really excited to get into this topic. I should preface this particular discussion by saying that MREA doesn't have an official position on nuclear energy, but we are interested in learning more about it, and we know that our audience is interested in learning more about it. So we're excited to bring in a couple speakers today, which I will introduce in a few moments. And Don, just a heads up, I haven't seen that email that I've been looking for. I wouldn't mind if you would try resending it, maybe. Just a side note. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into just a couple of introductory slides here, and then I'm going to pass it off to our speakers. So my goal is to kind of just lay the land for the discussion today, and then we'll bring in our experts. But nuclear energy, as far as the basics go, pretty much works using nuclear fission, which splits atoms, which releases heat, and that heat turns water into steam, which we then use to spin a turbine. So this isn't technically that different in terms of generating the electricity from something like using wind or water to spin a turbine, right? It's the same physical principle there. Obviously, the difference being the use of nuclear fission. The fuel source, uranium, is used because it has a really large nucleus with a whole lot of atoms in it. And each ceramic uranium pellet, which is what they use in the fuel rods, can produce about the same amount of energy as 150 gallons of oil. So it can produce a lot of energy. As far as how its reactor cores are compiled, the very basics are that you have these ceramic pellets with the uranium in them. They're placed in fuel rods that are about 12 feet long. Several hundred fuel rods make up a fuel assembly, and then the fuel assemblies make up the reactor core. So that's your very, very basic setup for a nuclear reactor. There are different types of nuclear reactors. The two of the more common are called light water reactors, and they're called light water because they just use regular water both as the coolant for the process and as what's called a neutron moderator. We're not going to get into the nuclear physics today, which I don't think any of you are signing up for, but just know that that is what helps control the reaction. So there is a substance in the reactor that helps control it, and in this case, it is the actual water itself that is used as coolant. There are two types of light water reactors. There's the pressure reactors, which heats a separate reservoir of water that turns into steam and then pushed through the turbine. And then there are boiling water reactors. And in the boiling water reactors, which is the one you can see on the screen, the reactor water is turned directly into steam, and that's what's pushed through the turbine. So the difference is whether or not you're directly heating the water in the reactor vessel, or if you're just heating a separate reservoir of water. And the impact there is going to certainly have to do with the radiation that may exist in the water after it comes out of, in the boiling water reactors, for example, that steam is going to be have some radioactivity to it. There are also what are called advanced module reactors that use different types of coolants. There are different type of designs to generate the electricity. Some of the ones that are getting attention right now are called high temperature gas reactors, sodium cooled fast reactors, and molten salt reactors. There's a lot of information online right now about the different types of these and how they work, and kind of, what elements are different than your typical light water reactor. But we're not going to get into those today. I think today we're going to talk at a little bit of a higher level just about nuclear energy in general. I will note in particular that the Legislative Services Division for Montana's legislature does have a lot of good information on these different types of reactors. One note is that the advanced module reactors, none of them are ready for the market right now, but these are ones that are furthest along in the process. And then there are also what are called small modular reactors, SMRs. And these are the ones that are getting more attention right now, particularly in Montana and through our legislature. And these aren't a different type of, the phrase small modular does not refer to a type of physical process. It has to do with the size of the design, roughly 50 to 330 megawatts, whereas larger reactors can be over 1,000 megawatts, so much bigger. As far as the market for nuclear energy right now, as of the end of 2020, there were 94 reactors active across the 28 states, and all of the reactors today are light water reactors. Like I mentioned, there aren't any that are other ones that are ready for the market at this current time, though there are pilot projects, which I think some of our speakers will mention. There are demonstration projects and pilot projects that are being discussed right now. And you can see mostly in the central and eastern part of the country, not so much out west. As of right now, nuclear makes up about 20% of the US electricity generation in the state, in the country, which is about on par with renewables, a little bit more than coal, and about half as much as natural gas. Those are kind of our main sources for electricity generation right now. And you can see in the renewables section, wind and hydro make up the majority. Solar is creeping up, and then there's some biomass and geothermal as well. But nuclear is about 20%, which is, a good fifth of the generation. And then there's the nuclear energy divide. So I'm not going to get too far into this because our speakers are going to address kind of the different sides of some of these discussions. But there is a divide right now, and certainly has been, over nuclear energy. Is it considered clean because of the radioactivity issues? Is it considered, safe? There's a lot of questions about it. In particular, for anybody who's been reading international news over the past couple months, France and Germany are both kind of spatting with each other right now over the use of nuclear energy in the European Union and their clean energy goals going forward. So the AP recently did a poll about nuclear energy, and there are about 2/3 of states that said that nuclear is absolutely going to be part of the future, and then another third that said absolutely not. Interestingly, US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm recently said that nuclear should be part of the mix going forward, or will need to be. And of course, then there's the bipartisan infrastructure bill that allocated a few $1 billion towards advanced reactor demonstration projects. So there's interest out there. There is certainly a lot of work being done on nuclear, but there are also a lot of considerations for how that needs to be done, whether it's safe, whether it's clean, and things like that. So, and whether it's economical. So we're going to jump right into getting into some of that today. Like a good graduate student that I am, I will also post my sources here, and I'll be happy to share these with anyone after the presentation if anybody wants them. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next presenter, Don Hindman. Don is an emeritus professor of geology at the University of Montana, where he taught for 40 years. He's also taught geology at Stanford University and has published several technical books and dozens of technical papers throughout his career. In 1983, he was appointed to a 6-person panel of the US National Academy of Sciences to evaluate the Swedish proposal for disposal of nuclear waste. The Swedish government had asked the panel to evaluate the lengthy KBS-3 report prepared by nuclear power companies to determine if their proposal for nuclear waste storage was adequate. Don is using his professional experience and additional research in a book he is writing on climate change, which will discuss nuclear energy among many other topics. Don has a bachelor's degree in geological engineering from the University of British Columbia and a PhD in geology from the University of California, Berkeley. So Don, I will ask you to unmute yourself. I'm going to go ahead and get your slide deck booted up here, and we'll be good to go.
Okay, Andrew's already mentioned most of what I have on this first image. That is the main sources for power production include a couple of fossil fuels they all know about. And coal, I would discount immediately because it's such a heavy polluter in all manner of ways, both air, water, climate change, you name it. Natural gas dominates, as Andrew mentioned, along then with the renewables. The main renewables that people think about are solar, wind, hydro, and often geothermal, and sometimes biomass, but biomass is a different sort of animal, which I won't talk about much. And then the big question, of course, is nuclear. And nuclear is not normally treated as a renewable, but in terms of its emission of greenhouse gases, it is in fact renewable. And at the moment, as Andrew mentioned, 20% of present nuclear power, or 20% of present power, is nuclear in the US. So it's an important thing. It's not increasing at the moment because of this debate between people who decide they want more nuclear, and people who say just the opposite. We can't have nuclear because it's dangerous. Okay, Andrew. Next slide. Okay, so let's think for a moment about what needs we have for various power sources. In other words, what are the attributes that make a difference and are going to help us decide? Well, I've listed 7 main ones here, and you note that I have indicated the power sources that I think are relevant in that context. And you'll also notice immediately that I've circled nuclear all the way down, meaning I have come to the conclusion that nuclear is good by most measures. So, first of all, needs to be reliable. Well, nuclear is certainly reliable. Natural gas is not too bad for reliability. Source-wise, it's something else. Hydro is reliable, except in a prolonged drought, because your hydroelectric dam has a reservoir behind it, and a prolonged drought, the depth of the reservoir drops enough that you can't even turn the turbines. So that can be and is an issue at present and at Boulder or Hoover Dam in Arizona. And it's a crisis situation for Arizona and California in that respect. Relatively low cost, yeah, renewables, certainly. Natural gas, fair. Nuclear is a little bit higher, but not unbearably higher. Needs to be reasonable cost over a long period of time without hindering production or affecting the economy. Well, what I mean with that in mind is nuclear continues to provide power almost regardless. Wind and solar, of course. Wind, when the wind blows, that's fine. Solar, when the sun shines, that's fine. But at times, neither of those work. The solar, of course, doesn't work at night and doesn't work well at high latitudes. Wind normally is thought to be pretty reliable, but as of this past summer and fall, the wind dropped abruptly, creating a crisis situation for example, Germany in particular, and also for Great Britain. So we can't depend necessarily on the wind. And the price of gas, natural gas in Northern Europe has skyrocketed as a result of that drop in wind. And the wind has come back up, but it keeps going up and down unpredictably at this point, probably because of climate change. Number 4, it needs to be safe at all stages. I will argue that nuclear is safe. If we look at deaths in nuclear versus deaths in coal production and use, oil, biomass, and gas, nuclear is very low. Very few deaths have occurred in nuclear. And of course, the other renewables are also pretty good shape, but not coal, and natural gas is certainly worse than nuclear by a fair margin, by a factor of several. we need to minimize land use and obviously damage to the environment. And small modular nuclear is ideal with that in mind. It doesn't cover very much ground. Even the major nuclear plants don't cover all that much space. The renewables, solar and wind, you can get into the details of how wind might affect land use. Obviously, you can graze cattle under it and even grow crops. But we have, of course, the problem of people not wanting wind because some people consider the wind turbines unsightly. And it's a real issue. And for solar, of course, it actually does cover ground. So that's open to further discussion. Not carbon emitting, and the issue there, of course, is climate change. The coal, oil, natural gas eliminate or emit large amounts of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide primarily. Nuclear and renewables don't, at least not in a significant way. Close to where the power is consumed, and my issue here is the transmission lines transporting power, for example, from Colstrip in Montana to even Missoula or beyond. There's a very large drop in power in the transmission lines. They waste a lot of energy, and we can't do much about that just because of the process of transporting it by wire. Nuclear, if the nuclear were to be designated as in, say, Billings, transporting that electricity to Missoula, you still lose a lot of power. But the small modular nuclear reactors are small enough that they can be placed close to where they'll actually use the power. That is close to a town. And obviously it doesn't have to be in the town, wouldn't want to be in the town, but close enough that the power loss by transmission is negligible. Next one, Andrew. Next slide. Okay, this is probably redundant given what Andrew has already said. Just the main types of nuclear reactors, but my main point here is that they're basically simple devices. They have complexity once you get into the details, of course, but they have a nuclear power reactor using uranium usually. That provides energy to an electric turbine, which turns to provide electricity, and the water has to be cooled thereafter, but they're basically simple devices. If we go to the next slide, please. Radiation is the thing that gets to people most. And here's the span of radiation from lower energy on the left to higher energy on the right. And visible light is right there in the center. The radiation that we're most concerned with are, for example, is labeled there in the lower right, cosmic rays. People get cosmic ray irradiation all the time. You go outside, you're going to get it, whether it's sunny or even cloudy to some extent. And it's ionizing radiation, and in large doses can cause cancer and various genetic changes. So cosmic rays are considered an issue. X-rays are among them. We use X-rays, and of course, you get your teeth zapped, or you check your bone or even internal organs. But the doses are relatively small, and the time is kept to a minimum. Next slide. Okay, let's go to the next one after that. Okay, this was a study that was done a few years ago, indicating that with the main sources of electric energy, the safest are on the left column and the cleanest in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the right column. So the long lines there for coal is very unsafe for a variety of reasons, partly in mining, partly in accidents, in power production, partly in the waste disposal. The waste disposal in Colstrip, of course, is just sitting there looming over us. Oil is not much better than coal. Natural gas is much better than coal, but still far more deaths. Well, for example, it says there are 2.8 deaths per year, I think it was. Biomass is not very different than that. But nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, that is the green ones, are pretty doggone safe. And if we were to compare nuclear with 0.07 deaths with natural gas at 2.8 deaths per unit of time, obviously that's a big difference. And we all know about the cleanliness of these things. The fossil fuels are far from clean in virtually every respect, and the renewables, and I'll include nuclear in this, are pretty doggone safe. Next slide, please. Okay, now people who don't like solar or are afraid of solar point to major excellence, and let me just touch on the three that people always point to. Chernobyl in the Ukraine was a long time ago, 1986. That killed several people, quite a few people, who were in the immediate blast zone and those who were sent in to put out the fire, which was a catastrophe. So, and Chernobyl, being part of the Soviet Union, is not known to be a place where, let's just say, the quality control is lacking. 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania didn't really kill many people. It did make a mess with the radiation. But Fukushima is the one that people point to most recently because it was only about 10 years ago. And it turns out that, and it's been studied thoroughly, no one died. Absolutely not a single person died or was severely sickened by the radiation itself. A few thousand people did die, something of the order of somewhere between 500 and 3,000 people did die. But the studies have shown very clearly that none of those deaths were from radiation. All were because of forced evacuation from the Japanese government, who panicked, of course, with the meltdown at Fukushima. And it was caused mostly by stress. People were taken away from their homes without being able to take any belongings with them. They were removed from friends and family and put in places where they didn't have contact with friends and family. And it was determined that that's what caused the deaths, not the nuclear radiation. If we look briefly in the next slide at nuclear radiation, it's just like light. Light is a radiation. And if you're right at the source, the light can be very bright. As you get farther away, if you get twice as far away, then the intensity of the light or the brightness of the light is a quarter as strong. And you get another unit of distance away, and then it again becomes a quarter of that. So distance is a huge effect for radiation. Punchline is, if there is radiation that has escaped or a radiation site you don't want to be close to it. The quickest way to reduce the problem is to get far away. You don't have to get very far away, but that's a significant issue. The kinds of radiation I won't get into because don't have time here, but the nuclear waste in the next slide. This is the way nuclear waste is stored now. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was going to have it stored underground in a mine extracted for that purpose, but that turned out to have all manner of problems, partly because of where it was being sited. In any case, present day waste storage, high-level waste storage, is the nuclear rods are encased in a metal, either steel or copper commonly, and that's encased in concrete. And you can tell by the scale of a person standing there that these things are about 6 or 7 feet in diameter. The rods are just in the core of that. So most of the thing is concrete. That doesn't provide much of a target for somebody who wants the nuclear material. It remains above ground, and you can say, well, that's not a great idea for permanent storage, but it's actually a very good idea if you want to be where, if you have leakage from the nuclear material or some sort of breakdown, you can fix it because you can immediately see where the leakage is and deal with it. Underground, that's a different story. Once it's buried underground, it tends to stay there. And if you have leakage, that can be a serious problem. So one last slide, just very briefly. Nuclear has come a long way. And there's the years down below, nuclear power generation back in the 50s, and the left end of the bar on the bottom, gone up through several generations. We are in generation 3 now for most designs, and they are incredibly safe. For example, the small nuclear reactors are partly buried underground, but not very far underground because they're not very big. And they're fail-safe partly because there's relatively few employees that can screw up in their decisions, partly because the control rods automatically drop by gravity, stopping a reaction if there's a problem. Or if it's a fire, then water also descends by gravity, taking care of the fire. And I've gone way beyond my allotted time, so let me just end there.
No, Don, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so very much for that information and for presenting all of it. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm going to ask Scott to go ahead and share his screen. And while he's doing that, I will read his bio. Dr. Scott Williams was raised in Salt Lake City and has lived in Utah much of his life, with stints in Eastern Canada and Wisconsin. He received a BA degree in American Literature from the University of Utah, and then went on to medical school and a residency in pediatrics, getting an Master's of Public Health along the way. He was on the faculty of the University of Utah's Department of Pediatrics for about 10 years, caring for children in various clinics that served Navajos, migrant workers, and inner city families. He then served in various executive positions at the Utah Department of Health during the 3-term administration of Governor Michael Leavitt. He was the chief medical officer for the Mountain Division of the Hospital Corporation of America for 8 years, supporting physicians at 10 HCA hospitals in Utah, Idaho, and Alaska. He very recently retired after 4 years as the executive director of the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, a nonprofit environmental policy and advocacy organization focused on clean air and clean energy. He has 3 grown sons and 3 small grandchildren, and is an avid cyclist, swimmer, and hiker. So Scott, thank you so much, and go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting an outsider of Montana to talk about this. I have a particular interest in this, having been at HEAL for the last 4 years. And the reason this is such an important issue in Utah is that, number one, we have one of the nation's largest radioactive waste disposal sites in the country out west of the Great Salt Lake, Energy Solutions. We have the only operating uranium mill in the country down in southeastern Utah by the Bears Ears National Monument near Blanding, Utah. And we currently are one of the places that is being recruited by one of these small modular reactor developers, NuScale, to have many small towns in Utah subscribe to this pilot nuclear power plant project that they're trying to get approved and developed in southern Idaho. And so we also have a history of being downwinders from the nuclear weapons testing in Nevada. So there's a sensitivity in this state to these issues. So I'm just going to click through. I realize that I started a little late. I'll try to kind of abbreviate some of this so that we have time for some questions. This is just a summary slide about HEAL. We're a group that's been around for about 20 years, and we focus on air quality, clean energy, and radioactive waste. So the challenge, as you all know, is reducing carbon emissions, and we don't have very much time left to really make dramatic reductions in carbon emissions. If the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to, by the middle of the 2020s, we need to start really producing these very significant drops in our carbon emissions. And it's a big order because there's a significant number of constraints. One of those is that we just have limited financial resources for a major transition in the energy sector. So even in the Build Back Better bill, which didn't pass yet, I guess, there was $500 billion for climate change. That sounds like a lot of money, but keep that figure in your head for a minute, because I'm going to get back to it at the next slide. But this just shows the cost to consumers, the sort of what does it cost to per megawatt, the levelized cost of energy to produce energy. And the only one of these sources of energy where the cost is actually increased since 2009 is nuclear energy. So when you talk about, we have solar, we have wind, we have battery storage, we have geothermal, most of them are either flat or coming down, but nuclear energy, the cost of nuclear energy is actually increasing. So when you have a limited amount of resource to do a big job like reduce carbon emissions, where do you want to spend your money? The second constraint is that we have limited time, as that first chart from the IPCC showed, to deploy these transition strategies. And just a little history of the nuclear power project in the United States. There's only 2 projects that have been initiated in the last 10 years or so. One is in South Carolina. They started that project in 2013. They had projected go-live dates for the 2 units they were building for 2016 and 2019 and an original budget of around $10 billion. That project got so over budget at $25 billion by 2017 that the project was canceled after they had spent $11 billion, and they've actually walked away from it and have sold the parts that they had built for scrap. And the citizens in South Carolina are going to be paying for that project for at least the next 20 years without ever getting a single electron of electricity out of it. The Vogtle units in Georgia, which are still under construction, were begun in 2013. They had a projected start date of 2016 and a budget of $14 billion. Their start date is now Unit 3 is third quarter of this year. Unit 4 will be sometime next year if they're able to stay on schedule. That schedule's been revised many times, and that cost is now north of $30 billion. So between those 2 projects, there's been about $40 billion spent. And that's when you think that we have $550 billion in the Build Back Better bill to address our climate change, just those 2 projects have consumed 40 billion of that. And so how many times are we going to sort of take that gamble and spend huge amounts of money on a technology that either can't deliver or is, with some of these new projects that Don mentioned, have yet to even be proven to be viable and from an engineering standpoint and a cost standpoint, let alone from a safety standpoint. None of them have actually been deployed in real time yet. So the third constraint is that we do have an existing and emerging energy infrastructure. As Don mentioned, we have transmission issues. You can't just plop energy generation anywhere. You have to connect it to the grid. The current infrastructure appears to favor a centralized generation model and replacing generation at existing coal and natural gas plants with something else. And primarily that's because regulated power companies, that is their business model. That's how their shareholders make money. That's why they don't like export credit rates on residential rooftop solar, because distributed energy takes away from their market. So you have to be careful when you hear about this. We have to do this in a certain way. There's distributed energy generation with renewables, true renewables, which nuclear actually isn't. They like to call themselves clean energy, but they're not renewable. And those modalities don't have the kind of lobby behind them yet that nuclear does. The other constraint we have is that we are going through major electrification of our vehicles, our buildings, and our industry. And interestingly enough, despite that, the demand for electricity has remained flat in the country over the last few years. So hopefully we'll be able to stay on top of that. But we are going to need more electricity than we've used in the past. And then the last one, which gets to this issue of reliability, is what's called load balancing. With the intermittency of wind and solar and renewables, you need some way to make up the gap there. There's a lot of different ways to do that besides what's used to be called baseload generation, coal, oil, and gas, and now nuclear. Nuclear is not very good at ramping up and down its power output. You can't just turn it off when you've got excess solar because you don't need it. And so it's not the most efficient way to do this, but there's strategies related to energy storage, multiple, not just batteries, but multiple forms of energy storage, a much better integration of the grid so we don't waste so much electricity on the grid, microgrids that allow electricity to be delivered over smaller transmission systems, as Don alluded to, and then distributed supply and demand management, where the power company can actually pull power from your solar panels when it needs it. It can turn off the air conditioning in a building for 15 minutes to try to smooth out the demand, and then energy efficiency, which can go a long way to decreasing the amount of electricity that we need. The National Renewable Energy Lab did a study about reliability and concluded that more than 80% of the electricity generated in 2015 could come from renewable energy technologies that are commercially available right now. We don't need to experiment with technologies that are unproven. We could get to 80% of reducing our carbon emissions by 2050 by just using the technologies we have today. And that includes some of the things I just talked about, with more flexible generation and grid storage and transmission, and that we can have deep reductions in our greenhouse gas emission through deploying technologies that we already have. This report was generated back in 2012. We now feel like it's the last 5 to 10% of the energy supply that's going to be the hardest, but there's a lot of storage technologies coming online. And as with solar and wind, the price of these technologies is dropping dramatically. And so most people are very hopeful that by 2030, we're going to have much better ways of delivering this following load power need than we have right now, at a cost that will be competitive. So this is if you use utility scale photovoltaic solar with a battery, class 5 battery, and then nuclear. This is the cost of those two combinations of power. And the cost of utility solar with battery is projected to drop by 2050 to less than half the cost of nuclear. So again, when you have limited resources to spend on this and limited appetite in the public of how much they want their utility bill to be, this makes a lot of sense. In terms of greenhouse gases, the nuclear energy is comparable to photovoltaic solar. Wind is even less, and lithium-ion battery storage is much less. So it does okay in terms of carbon emissions. It does reduce carbon emissions, but it has no advantages over other technologies that have fewer of the cost and other environmental problems that nuclear has. Really quickly, the way the nuclear fuel chain works is you mine the uranium and then you produce nuclear tailings. And all these stars show where nuclear waste accumulates. Then you send it to the mill and it converts it to what's called yellow cake. And there's waste that's generated in that process, radioactive waste. Then you go to the enrichment process where you centrifuge it to separate the U-235 from the U-238. That generates a type of waste called depleted uranium, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then you fabricate the fuel and you put it in the reactor. And then once those reactor rods are no longer able to generate enough heat, it comes out, and those are called spent fuel rods, and that's a form of radioactive waste. Then you have to figure out how to storage. Don showed those pictures. And in some countries, they reprocess that waste, but in the United States, that's currently illegal. It's a very easy way to generate plutonium, which can be converted into weapons. It can also be reprocessed into uranium fuel that can go through this cycle again. But there's waste that occurs even with the reprocessing that you have to figure out where to put somewhere. So there's a series of questions that should be asked anytime a nuclear power project is being proposed, and here they are. In terms of mining, where will the uranium for these new nuclear projects be mined? Who will be responsible for the cleanup of the mine once it's played out? And how will it be funded? There's over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo reservation today, and that are increasing the radiation levels in homes and water sources in that reservation. That's just one small part of the country. So these questions have to be asked and answered every time a nuclear power project is proposed. In terms of milling, when they convert it to yellow cake, there's a history of the mill near Blanding, Utah, of contaminating groundwater with radiation. And that groundwater travels to homes and nearby. And so we need to ask, where will the uranium ore be milled? And where will the radioactive byproducts of the milling process be disposed of? In terms of enrichment, where you centrifuge the uranium to get the U-235 out of it, where will the byproducts or so-called depleted uranium be stored? Depleted uranium is unique in that it's only type of radioactive waste that gets more and more and more radioactive over time. There's 750,000 metric tons of depleted uranium in stockpiles that the Department of Energy manages now. Energy Solutions near Salt Lake City wants a contract to dispose of that depleted uranium near the Great Salt Lake. So the question is, where will that be stored and disposed of, and who will pay for that storage? And then importantly, since this material gets more and more radioactive over time, who will have custody of that depleted uranium as it does become more radioactive, and assure that it remains safe and secure from the public? The nuclear power plant development and operations. So the question is, how much of this project will be subsidized by local, state, and federal funds? The NuScale project, they want ratepayers in small towns in Utah to pay for this as yet unproven project. If this is a project that has viability for a future source of power, it should be funded by venture capitalists or by perhaps the federal government, not by the people who are paying their electricity bills in towns around the West. What assurances are in place that the project won't significantly exceed the project budget and timeline, like the ones I talked about earlier? What will be required to maintain a well-tested safety evacuation zone around the plant? Don mentioned Fukushima. 160,000 people were evacuated, and you can second guess whether the government made the right call, but they literally had hours once they were notified that that plant was melting down to decide whether to leave people in place or evacuate them. That's not a decision that you can take a gamble on with people's lives. So I don't know that any of us, if we heard that the nuclear power plant down the street was melting down, would want to just stay in our homes and trust the government that we weren't going to be have radiation exposure. And then finally, in this era of climate change and desertification, how much water is required to operate this plant? Where will it come from? And what's the cost? And then finally, where will the spent fuel rods be stored prior to permanent disposal? Some of these cement casts Don talked about are already deteriorating in some of the places where they exist. The people there want them out. And we've been trying for 60 years to figure out where to put them, and we haven't come up with a solution yet. How will they be protected from a terrorist attack? And what would be a reasonable timeline and cost to develop a permanent disposal strategy? And then for all of these phases, there's two questions that need to be asked. One is, how much of this industry activity will occur on or near tribal lands? A lot of nuclear contamination has been placed near the lands of indigenous tribes in the United States. They bear a disproportionate burden of the nuclear industry. And then how will this material be transported? So this shows a site where all of the spent fuel rod waste currently exists. This is Yucca Mountain right here. And these are the routes that it would require to get all of that fuel, spent fuel, to Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain probably won't get resurrected, but there's still attempts to do that. And if that were to occur, 10,000 shipments of that waste would come right through Utah into Nevada. So finally, I just want to acknowledge that there's no source of energy that doesn't have environmental impacts, even renewables and battery storage. There's mining issues with the materials that are needed to make batteries and some of the renewable products. There's manufacturing waste that occurs by building solar panels. There are some innovator companies that are working to solve these problems, and they've actually developed some very interesting ways of doing that. As Don mentioned, there's land use and habitat issues. There are some strategies that make use of that land, and then some people have proposed floating solar farms. There's product use and disposal. So once wind turbines or solar panels are no longer can be used, how do you dispose of that material? And there are people working on that. It's difficult to dispose of that now because they're composite materials, and recycling composite materials is difficult. So I don't want to pretend that there's a green halo around renewables and battery. All of these modalities of energy have their downsides, but the downsides of nuclear, in our minds, far exceed the downsides of these other strategies, which the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has said are adequate to meet most of our power needs. And finally, a lot of people go, you environmental tree huggers, you never like nuclear and you say no to everything. These are folks who aren't necessarily opposed to nuclear per se, but they have yet to see that these small modular reactor and what are so-called advanced nuclear projects meet the tests of economic viability. And these are physicists and energy analysts at places like Stanford and the University of British Columbia, the Union of Concerned Scientists, two former members of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Taxpayers for Common Sense have all said that these small modular reactor proposals do not yet pass the smell test to be receiving federal funds, and especially not to be put into a bonding situation where people paying their electricity bills should have to fund the development of these projects. So that's it, Andrew. I'll turn it back to you, and yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And as we can definitely tell, there's a lot to both sides of this. Don talked about a lot of the benefits, and Scott talked about a lot of the drawbacks, and this is why I personally, taking my MREA hat off, I'm very torn about nuclear energy. It's a really interesting and complex topic. So I just want to thank both of our speakers for joining us today and providing a really great overview and analysis. As both of them mentioned, there's so much more that we certainly couldn't even get into today, and there's a lot to it. We've gone way over our time, and that's entirely my fault and all the technical difficulties and starting late. So I apologize, but if folks want to stick with us, there was one question that came in from the audience that I wanted to make sure that we got to. And this, I think I'll direct towards Scott just because it came up during your presentation. But Scott, Ali asked, why are people and developers, I'm assuming, grossly underestimating the time and cost affiliated with these projects? Is there anything that's been identified there as why a number of these projects are running over so often?
Well, I mean, I think I don't suspect anything nefarious. I think and I think Don mentioned this maybe in the op-ed that I read, Don, is that a lot of projects go over cost. I mean, the initial estimates are based on early engineering analyses, and then they refine those over time. I think a couple of the problems are, number one, these are very complicated, and there's a lot of regulation around them. And the reason there's a lot of regulation around them is because they can produce serious accidents. Now, Don talked about, that there haven't been that many accidents, but the problem is when you have an accident at a nuclear power plant, and if it doesn't go according to plan, it can be a catastrophic event. And so there's safety issues that have to be considered. I think the other thing is that you have to generate a certain amount of energy for a certain amount of hours of the day in order to make the price that you can charge competitive in the market. And so they're always trying to kind of tweak it so that they can do that. And then they're looking for subscribers who want to subscribe to their power as opposed to a source of power that's cheaper. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think that the bottom line is a lot of projects go over. These projects in Georgia and South Carolina more than doubled their budget in the course of a very short time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. I don't see any other questions in from the audience. For those of you that are still with us, if you have any other questions, feel free to go ahead and submit them. Don, I personally wanted to direct a question towards you because I thought there was an interesting point that Scott brought up, which I think for those working in the energy sector, we hear about a lot, especially in the context of renewables, where you have studies and experts looking at how much of our energy system we could provide electricity using just renewables. But there is that, 5 or 10% years ago, we thought it was 20%, but that number has shrunk. Do you feel like that's a role for nuclear? Do you see it as something that's more of like the larger mix, or do you think it's more something to kind of supplement and come in to help reach that last 5 or 10%?
Well, I don't think anyone should view nuclear as the way of generating electric power. Obviously, it has to be used as a supplemental means of providing power. And I don't know what that percent is. If it's 20% of the country's power now, it could be as much as maybe 40%. It's a pretty good baseline source for power. And when you take the key renewables like solar and wind, you get the quip about the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. Well, certainly true for solar. Very obvious that you can't get solar all the time because you can't get it at night and you can't get it in the Arctic. And wind has its ups and downs, and that there are serious problems now, as I briefly mentioned, in Northern Europe, where they were depending upon natural gas for a large part of their electrical power. And it dropped unexpectedly last summer and even just a few weeks ago. And that created big issues because Germany, for example, I think it depends upon about 40% or so of their total power supply from wind. And then it suddenly dropped to way below what they had planned. So where do they get it? Well, they were depending upon Russia for that, and they have a pipeline that's been feeding them. And of course, if you watch the news these days, there are all kinds of machinations of what's going on between whether Russia is going to continue to supply that gas. They have not increased the supply, even though requested. They're obviously using it for other reasons, or political issues. But the punchline is you can't depend upon wind to supply as much as you think you might need. Solar and wind and certain other renewables are ideally the way to go. I don't think we can ever come up with enough to provide the needs that we have either now or in future. Beyond that, it gets into an awful lot of issues and a lot of opinions.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Don. And you brought up a couple really important issues there too. I mean, just in general in the energy system, and I think both of you touched on reliability at some point. I mean, even here at home, right, the really, really unfortunate situation last year in Texas, which obviously had a lot to do with just their regulatory setup and the actual infrastructure. But even then, during that crisis, the wind was actually overproducing more than they forecasted, and even then there were issues, right? So which had to do the other generation sources and being able to transmit power to and from Texas, and a whole host of issues. But I think one of the big takeaways here for those who haven't noticed throughout the presentation is that this is a really, really complex issue, and when you talk about energy ever, you can easily go down the rabbit hole. But I'm looking at the clock, and I know we've gone over, and again, my apologies for the technical difficulties and for starting late, but I want to give a big thank you again to our presenters for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and expertise. For those who stuck around, thank you so much for joining us. Our next presentation is going to be March 2nd. We're going to be talking about storage and batteries, which I know both of our presenters today brought up, which are certainly a key part of our energy future, both at the distributed and large and community scale and utility scale. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Don. And we hope to see everyone next month when our Exploring Energy series continues.